All right. Well, hello and welcome. Thanks for tuning in to episode 3 of something we're calling Processing the Pandemic. My name is Jamie Hart, one of the pastors at Crosspoint, and here with one of the other pastors at Crosspoint, Erik Rome.
Hey, guys.
So, Erik, how you been doing, man?
Good. How about you?
I am doing all right. So thankful that we get this opportunity again just to converse for a few minutes. It's not a long episode or podcast, but we have been sort of looking over some things that we think this this pandemic rather is like revealing different issues that are coming up. I would encourage you as well, if you missed the first couple, if you go to our website, cpwp.org, and click under media, you will see a link there to some COVID-19 resources. And so the episodes from previously will be there as well, because we dealt with things like grief in the first week, and then we also looked at kind of rest, renewal, rhythms, different things that could be helpful for us during this time. And today we want to talk about something that is just such a key component to all of life. We want to talk about relationships. And so relationships obviously existed pre-pandemic.
Yes.
They're still going right now, but there's some particular probably challenges right now, I think, that we're all facing. But there's also some real opportunities as well. And so I wanted to just kind of start out by asking you, like, as we kind of just zoom out, just sort of at a high level, what do you think are some of the things that have been happening as it just pertains to relationships? What has this pandemic brought about? I think, like we talked about, there's grief, there's a whole range of emotions. And so what are some of the things that you're observing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that we started talking about in the first episode was how in the midst of this pandemic, there's incredible loss going on. So, there's physical loss, economic loss, but there's also a deep relational loss that's happening right now too. And I think we're experiencing the effects of social distancing, which is a good thing that we should all be engaging with right now. But it's one of those things that it's there to keep us safe, but it's also a drastic measure in one sense. So a couple of things that I think we're losing from it is with the social distancing comes this relational loss. First, just in physical proximity. We are embodied creatures. We were created with senses, and through these, we experience God, we experience each other more. Touch is, I think we can underestimate sometimes how important that is in our relationships. The whole world of nonverbal communication is completely gone right now. Even in a Zoom call, there's still so much that you can't see and sense and feel and what the other person is trying to say to you. But then there's also a loss in not just our physical proximity, but our more, you could say, just emotional, spiritual proximity. We're just, by and large, less connected right now in general. I've plenty of friends who I haven't talked to or seen in a couple months now, since it's all happened. We're feeling, because of that, I think, less known by each other in something that's a really vulnerable situation where we would want to have the opportunity to be seen and known by other people.
Right.
And then on the flip side, we're getting to share less in what God's doing in other people's lives, where normally we're encouraged and grow in our faith in talking with other people, hearing about what God's doing in their life, and that is cut off too. And so not only physically has the social distancing kind of but hindered our relationships, but then with that, there's this loss of kind of emotional, spiritual proximity as well.
For sure. Yeah, like what you were saying of it is helpful to think through when we would take any other issue that's going on in our life. Somebody's sick, they're dealing with job loss, they're dealing with some emotional, some trauma, whatever, like that just sort of embodied presence, just even being able to go and sort of like the ancient Jewish practice of like, I'm not even going to say anything, I'm just going to sit here with this person. Like that's almost impossible to do. And you're right, that lack of even if somebody wasn't a big hugger necessarily, like the physical touch does actually matter. It's such a weird thing to be like, hi, from 6 feet away, and not feel this ability to move closer to one another. And so there's some definite loss. I was thinking I was kind of reviewing some notes for prepping for this, and one of the things that I was reminded of, some work of different sociologists too that would say, hey, we connect in a variety of different ways. And this isn't exhaustive, and there's probably more categories, but some break it down into four things that we connect in kind of different size spaces almost. So we've got public space, social, personal, and intimate. And one of the things I'm realizing in all of this too is the sense of loss you're speaking of. We've lost a lot of the public, like we can't be in larger gatherings, and that actually does matter. The notion that like, oh, we just want to live in a world of all intimate space. Well, intimate is like handful of people living in close proximity. Many of us are getting that right now. It's not a knock on our family or not, but I think what we're feeling is like, oh, I'm created for intimate space. Absolutely. But I also need space with kind of in a personal, maybe 8, 10, 12 people. I also need some social of 20, 30 people. And I also really do get value, and there's my life flourishes when I do even have some of the larger kind of public space. And that could be from a church service to a concert you go to a sporting event.
Right.
And so that's been one of the things I've been thinking through as well, and maybe just could be helpful as we're all sort of processing our sense of loss. And even as we think about whenever returning goes back, it's like, oh, we've been designed, like all of those spaces actually matter. And it's not to knock the intimate, like that absolutely needs to be cultivated and worked on, is super important. But these other spaces matter as well.
Yeah. And the reality is no one person is built to have a loss, a relational loss like we're experiencing right now. When this all happened, my wife sent me a video of it was showing how every different Enneagram type was processing the prospect of isolation and the pandemic and all of these things. And my type, the 5, which is deeply introverted, it was just a person giggling and laughing to themselves because all of their social engagements for the next 2, 3, 6, 8 months got canceled.
Right.
But the reality is that's not true at all. I mean, I am near hermit status sometimes as an introvert, and yet I'm still craving for connection with people.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And part of that is just the way that we were made. We were created in the image of a God who lives in what you could kind of think of as this community of love. That's kind of how St. Augustine talked about it. He said, if we see love, we see the Trinity. They are 3, the lover, the beloved, and the love. They kind of exist in this dance, as Tim Keller calls it, for a different, kind of mixed metaphors here. And so we were created in that image. And so that's why you see in the garden, in perfection, God says it's not right for man to be alone. And then when you look at the story, where the story's going for the world and for humanity, it ends with Christ coming back, renewing this world, and we will live in this new creation where we'll be in these perfect relationships of love. I love the way that Jonathan Edwards, is a pastor in the mid-1700s up in New England. This is how he describes kind of what heaven, what the new earth, the new creation will feel like. He says, every soul there is a note in some concert of delightful music that sweetly harmonizes with every other note and all together blend in the most rapturous strains in praising God and the Lamb forever. You get this picture that we were created for these loving, meaningful relationships, and in the end, when God restores everything, we'll have these loving, meaningful relationships. And even right now, we're trying to find ways to connect with that. So, I mean, we've talked about this before, but Marina Abramovich did, I think it was 2012, she did a piece at the Museum of Modern Art in New York called The Artist is Present, where she just sat in I think it was just a wooden chair.
Kind of like this kind of setup,
yeah, there was a table. And it was 6 feet even, so this would have worked for social distancing.
She was ahead of her time,
ages.
yes.
Yeah. And then on the other side was an empty chair, and people could just come and sit and get uninterrupted eye contact with her. Nothing was said. You just got to stare into the face of another image bearer who was created for that same level of connection. And I mean, there were lines around the block for it, and it was just from the time the museum opened till it closed, it was packed with people wanting to get in on this. But the reality is that we have this longing for relationship, but it's a longing that isn't met right now, is it? And so why if we were created for relationship and we're going to end in these perfect, beautiful relationships, why do we not feel that right now?
Yeah, because in theory, right, one would look and say, so we even talk kind of that intimate space. And so maybe you've got roommates or your family, a spouse, kids, whatever, and thinking, maybe we went into this idealistically too, like, man, I know this is difficulty, but there's going to be like this real flourishing. And maybe you're experiencing all of that in your household. It's just humming along and it's amazing.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people are experiencing this like, okay, we're going a little stir crazy, and there can be more problems, and this thing is revealing. And one of the things I think is really key to this, because you're right, that longing is there. I mean, it's why people, like you said, they lined up to come have another human being just kind of stare at them. I mean, I remember reading about that, and people were like literally some breaking down in tears, like they hadn't been seen by anyone really. Just their humanity was being maybe seen for the first time in a long time, they felt like. And so we got that beautiful longing, and yet we can't think right now that, once the governor lifts more things, as excited as we were about some of that yesterday, right? Yeah. Or that suddenly everything's going to go back, because it's not this problem out there. At the end of the day, the problem with relationships is not quarantine and shelter in place or COVID-19. Like, the problem is in here. And so I was reading an article, and we'll try and remember to post the link to it, called "Preparing Our Hearts Today for Post-Pandemic Fellowship." It's a guy by a guy named Alistair. I'm blanking on his name right now. But anyway, I'll post the link.
Alistair.
Alistair, yes.
How many Alistairs do you
Groves,
know?
I believe. Yeah. He works for an organization called CCEF, Christian Counseling Education Foundation. And he wrote this article, and here's what he said. I thought this was really insightful. He said, in regards to what the pandemic is revealing, it's always been there, but maybe we're becoming more aware of it. He said, there's a very core theme I believe we need to grapple with right now. He says, it's your heart that matters most in an interaction, not the medium. All right. So I might knock like Zoom or live streaming and all that. At the end of the day, though, it's less about the medium, and it really is more about like what's going on with my heart. He says, getting our hearts in the right place today will set us up for a helpful perspective on tomorrow. And that's Alistair Groves. I wrote his name down. I finally found it. Okay. And so one of the things he talked about is that the real villain in all of this pandemic is my self-centeredness. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's painful to talk about. Right. And yet, if we're going to have flourishing relationships in the pandemic, post-pandemic, like that's really what we got to get to. I mean, I know I have that longing for a relationship, but what gets in the way, it's not other people. It's
not a proximity issue.
And it's not a proximity issue. You're right. If the governor suddenly lifted, it's like, hey, everybody can hang out in large crowds and hug everybody.
We found a vaccine. Yeah. Right. Take it now, and everyone can go back to life as normal.
There'll probably be this initial surge of like everybody's happy and getting along.
Yes.
And it'll last for a day tops, right? And then we'll realize, that
you're
person,
more optimistic than me.
An hour. Yeah. Whatever it happens to be, right? It will rear its ugly head, as it's been doing in this, that the issue really is our self-centeredness. And so at the end of the day, one of the things I've been thinking about is, and I guess we do see that, right? Like we've got this proximity right now. We can't have proximity with everybody, but I can have proximity with my wife and with my kids, and yet, my self-centeredness is still there. And this is a old story that goes all the way back to the fall. I mean, this is what happens in Genesis 3. And so that's never gone away. Like that's the root of the thing, the cause. But there's different, I almost say like manifestations or ways that sort of shows up culturally. Like, so what are some of the things that you've kind of seen down through the ages where this self-centeredness, like how does it actually manifest itself culturally maybe?
Yeah. So I think you could so if you say from a spiritual standpoint, part of the enemy of us experiencing the relationships we were created for is sin, self-centeredness. I think if you wanted to come at it from a cultural way, You could say you could swap out self-centeredness as being the thing that hinders us from experiencing the relationships we were created for. You could swap that out with freedom. So freedom is the American ethic. I used to, live up in New England, and New Hampshire, their license plates, live free or die, which always just didn't seem like New Hampshire was the state to champion that, but here we are. So
Yes.
that is the ethic.
We have a lot of viewers from New Hampshire that we've just offended. But anyway,
Yes, yeah.
continue. Yes.
That is the ethic of America, and it's not a new thing. You can trace it all the way back to, how the European aspect of our country was founded with the Pilgrims on the Mayflower, leaving the Church of England, this group of dissenters, Presbyterians, and Anabaptists, and leaving there and coming to America for religious freedom. And that pilgrimage of breaking from what they thought was this oppressive government and religious influence in their lives, and finding freedom in this new territory where they could be whoever they wanted to be, do whatever they wanted to do, that really set up, and there are some obviously great things about the Pilgrims and the Puritans, but that mindset of, I want freedom and autonomy. I'm leaving one place, go to another place so I can be who I want to be, do what I want to do. That infiltrated then really a lot of the narrative for our country. So you think about when the Enlightenment happened in the mid 1700s. It was experienced different ways in different countries, and in America, as opposed to France and England and Germany, in America, the Enlightenment was this fight for political freedom. So it started with, I want this religious freedom, then it moved into, I want this political freedom, and then now today you could say it's moved into this fight for individual freedom, that we do it different ways. Robert Bellah, who's a sociologist, is a sociologist I think he's at Stanford now, wrote a really influential book on this in the 80s called Habits of the Heart, where he describes the American spirit as what he calls this expressive individualism. That, as Johann Herder, he's a German philosopher, said, we all have our own unique way of being, and our destiny in life is to figure out how to express that to the maximum capacity. And so this is what a lot of people call the sovereign self, that I think I should be able to live with this complete autonomy, take the same mindset that the Pilgrims had, that the Founding Fathers had, on and on down through our country, this idea of, I'm going to leave anything that feels oppressive, anything that feels like it's hindering me from being who I want to be, doing what I want to do. And the hard part is, freedom isn't an entirely bad thing. So you think about the Apostle Paul in Galatians 5.
Right.
For freedom, Christ set you free.
Right.
Tertullian, one of the church fathers in the 4th century, said that the freedom of the man is the greatest gift that Christianity had brought to the Roman Empire at that time. Martin Luther, left the Roman Catholic Church because he said, no, there's freedom in Christ, and we're saved by grace through faith, not works. And so freedom in itself isn't a bad thing, but the rugged, radical freedom that we try to get right now, especially in our culture, limits our ability to live in relationships with people. Because any relationship, whether it's a romantic, kind of love relationship like marriage, whether it's just a platonic friend relationship, a working relationship, to really experience that relationship at its full involves a certain loss of freedom, a certain submitting some of your will to the other person, of saying, I'm not going to get to be who I want to be and do what I want to do at every moment in time right now, and us to still be in a relationship. And so that kind of modern ethic of freedom that started with the Pilgrims and is now in overdrive right now, it really hinders us from experiencing a lot of the relationships that we want. I mean, you talk to people all over the place today in America. It doesn't matter, what age group you're in. They'd all say, I want community, I want connection, I want relationships, but don't ask for my freedom.
Right.
And until you're willing to give some of that up, we're not going to live in these relationships that we were created for.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I appreciate that sort of nuance too that you're speaking of, I mean, we've got part of our mission statement as a church is helping people find freedom. And so it's that freedom that the gospel brings.
Yes.
Probably some of the problematic things that end up is when I want, it's sort of divorcing the gospel from the, taking that out of the equation, out of the conversation. It's just left with this very humanistic sort of view of it. It's like, well, no, that's not going to create flourishing at all. And so our encouragement, just as we continue to process this, I think in, whether it be these episodes on Thursday afternoon and just as we're living all of this out, we want to make sure that not just for you guys watching it, but for us as well, there is that, let's be thankful for that longing that God's created us. It's not good for man to be alone, that God has created us to need one another. So let's welcome that. Let's embrace that. But let's also recognize that what prohibits it, it's not shelter-in-place orders or, a virus that's going around. I mean, what it actually keeps us from experiencing it is that self-centeredness, that overdrive for freedom. Because I'm thinking about, pick any one of Paul's letters. We've been in 2 Corinthians as a church. Over and over again, Paul he doesn't have physical proximity to a group of people, but man, he loves them and he cares for them, and he's utilizing the technology of his day. So he didn't have Zoom or Facebook Live or anything like that, but he probably would have utilized it if he had it. So he's taken pen to paper and he's writing and he's sending letters through couriers and through other friends of his. And it shows us like, hey, he would have longed to be physically present, but the relationships can continue, because what do you see Paul doing? Well, he's doing what he didn't do it perfectly, but he's seeking to follow the way of Jesus, who left everything, who sacrificed everything, who put his, said, not my will, Father, but yours be done. That took him all the way to a cross. And so, if we can kind of just as an encouragement, I think what we got to continue to do, because it's a real big issue. I got a really big self-centeredness issue, and it was always there, but the pandemic is revealing it a bit more. I thought it'd be helpful just to read this number of different places we could go, but I love the way it's spoken of in John 15, verse 13. It says these very simple words: "Greater love has no one than this, than someone lay down his life for his friends." So as we think relationships and we think friendships and we think, man, how am I going to cultivate this? We look to Jesus, who showed us what love actually looked like, and he laid down his life, and he welcomes us in, and he calls us friends. And if we're going to have those relationships cultivated and developed, that's what it's going to look like as we look to Jesus, as we repent of our sin, when we see how holy he is, and we repent of our selfishness and that over-desire for kind of the wrong kind of freedom, and then realize, wow, he still pursued me, he still loves me, and that gives us the resources to go and to love other people. And so I know our hope is that we will come on the other side of this more ready even for that proximity, that we might actually be able to love people better than we did prior to the pandemic. Well, guys, thank you so much for tuning in today. Again, if you got questions, if you got particular topics you'd like to hear us address, would encourage you to leave us a message on Facebook or on YouTube, or email us at elders@cpwp.org. Please know that we're praying for you. We look forward to gathering on Sunday morning through the live stream and continue to worship Jesus together. And so thanks for tuning in, and thanks for being the church, and we'll talk soon.